Hello, on behalf of Spotlight Sports Group, welcome to the 2022 BetTech Ecosystem webinar. I'm Camilla Wright of RedKnot, a specialist sports and sports betting communications agency, and I'll be hosting a discussion to explore the second edition of the BetTech Ecosystem and to get the latest thoughts on the industry from fellow experts, Harry von Behr, the co-US CEO of Spotlight Sports Group, Nic Sulksy, the CCO of PointsBet Canada, Chris Grove, a partner at industry analyst Eilers and Krejick, and Josh Brown, a director at PwC. BetTech is now in its second year, and while not definitive, it is designed to explore the critical segments that make up the sports betting ecosystem, both in visual form and in an accompanying report. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our experts for coming in today and welcome each of them to say a few words about themselves. Over to Harry von Behr.
Thanks, Camilla. As Camilla said, I am CEO of the US business at Spotlight Sports Group and also managing director of all of our sports activities. So really looking forward to discussing the BetTech report and all the good work that's gone into it with the esteemed panel here.
And Nic Sulksy.
Hi, everybody. And Camilla, thanks so much for having me and welcoming me on this panel with Chris, Josh, and Harry. I'm Nic. I'm the Chief Commercial Officer for PointsBet in Canada. I was actually the first employee of the Canadian division of PointsBet. I've been here for over a year now. Previous to joining PointsBet, I was an operator and a builder primarily in the daily fantasy sports space in the US. Just previous to PointsBet, I built a company called Monkey Knife Fight, which was acquired by Bally in January of 2021, but I've been effectively an operator for about 15 years now. So I'm really looking forward to having this conversation with everybody.
And over to Chris.
Great. Thank you, Camilla. So Chris Grove, I'm a partner emeritus at Eilers and Krejick Gaming. I'm also a co-founding partner at Akias Investments, which is a specialist VC firm that provides capital primarily to C+ through Series B companies focused on the online gambling opportunity.
And last but not least, Josh.
Hey, Josh Brown here, Director in the PwC Global Gaming and Betting Centre of Excellence, focused on M&A strategy, growth strategy, and value creation.
Thank you all. Maybe the first thing we can do in the webinar is just to look at the report and the BetTech ecosystem and the segments within it. Harry, maybe you could lead us off. What was your thoughts on the ecosystem and the report from this year?
I thought, again, it was a great piece of work. I think it is a great piece of work. Very useful to try to visualize the industry as a whole and have that sort of crib sheet on your desk when thinking about which businesses are present in which spaces in terms of, potential partners, targets from an acquisition point of view, and just general innovation in the space. So I think I find it a very useful piece of content from that perspective. As always, I took a lot of interest in seeing which new businesses appeared in the graphic as well, because it's always good to understand who's making moves and who's entering different either new segments or broadening into different segments as well. So I've found it very useful, have it nicely laminated on my desk thanks to our marketing department, and use it as a place to go whenever I have any sort of thoughts or questions about different sectors within the industry.
Thank you. Josh, have you got anything you would like to add to that?
No, I think it's worth flagging that this is quite a unique industry with quite a unique sense of operators and providers within it, and having that formalization that brings it together is helpful.
And Chris?
I think the only thing I would add is it's fascinating to watch it, I think, become more and more challenging to put a company in a given segment, as more and more companies are striving, I think, to provide more and more services on the supplier side to their operator partners, and more operators are moving increasingly into what had historically been the dominion of suppliers. So it's definitely valuable to segment the industry into those discrete categories, but I imagine as the years go by, it will become more and more of a challenge to say you belong specifically in this slice because increasingly folks are doing more and more of various bits of the pie.
And Nic, you've already said you moved from fantasy sports and building things to sportsbook operators. I guess you'd concur with Chris on this?
Well, I mean, absolutely. And I'm sure this won't be the last time I agree with Chris today. I think that, as an operator, and as an operator that really does pride itself on owning and controlling its entire technology stack, being able to be aware of all the different vendors and where not only where certain operators fit into slices, but where others think they do, is a pretty important perspective for us to have. And I'll speak, and as I will throughout our conversation, primarily about Canada. When Ontario opened up, there has been an extreme amount of competition. There are a lot of operators who are currently in market, both from a sports betting and from an iGaming perspective, and trying to figure out differentiated lanes for an operator like PointsBet to drive through. It becomes very important to have a snapshot like that, because it does save. It saves a lot of time, right? It's a really great resource to have. So I'm very appreciative of the work that you all put in, because it does save us a lot of time.
There has been and there's going to be a lot of M&A activity, I think, across these segments in the industry. Josh, how do you see the coming year?
Yeah, it's a hot topic at the moment, and there's a couple of different trends that we're seeing across the universe. The way that we've been seeing, or the way we've been articulating it, is operators or sort of providers are doubling down on their core. There's been a number of divestitures of non-core assets. So you saw on the B2B side, you saw the likes of Cygames or Light & Wonder last year getting rid of their lottery division, the Playtech and Finalto divestiture there. You saw B2B companies getting rid of B2C assets in terms of IGT Lottomatica, or Flutter getting rid of OGM on the other side. But equally, there has been a large number of people really investing in core assets. So SSG's Alarm acquisition. You saw Better Collective in doing a number of deals in the space and in content too. And from our perspective, there's good rationality that continuing as well.
Harry, I guess you've got looking at this from a sort of sportsbook and content capacity. What are your thoughts on M&A across North America and UK?
I think, well, one thing I'd just like to pick up before that on Nic's comment there, and then on what Josh said as well, the kind of the dichotomy between owning your full tech stack versus having a real focus on your core competencies, I think is a really interesting one in a world where cost of capital is low. There's sort of a lot of how should we say, a lot of heat potentially in share prices, and therefore the ability to kind of fund acquisitions, certainly in the public markets, then there's likely to be a lot more of that consolidation. I think it's going to be really interesting now, where there's a lot more scrutiny on what are businesses' core strengths, what are they really focused on, and therefore how do they think about acquiring and onboarding those sorts of businesses and assets and capabilities versus areas where it is more beneficial to perhaps outsource as well. So I think it'd be interesting to get the panelists' views on that as well. But appreciated some more sort of theoretical conversation in terms of the actual practicalities from a US and UK perspective. I think there's less assets in the market than there were a couple of years back, which is pretty obvious given the amount of M&A that's happened, but probably speaks to the value of those that are available in a market where they are supply constrained. I think it becomes even more interesting from an acquirer's point of view.
Chris, can I ask if you've got anything to respond to that?
I would say on the North American side, specifically in the US, we haven't seen the level of M&A activity that you might have expected if someone described the situation to you in a vacuum. I think that it will be a nothing and then everything all at once sort of wave. I think that there are a lot of people still waiting for things to get cheaper. And there is a belief that things will get cheaper still. Why buy something this week if you're convinced that it will be more affordable next week? But I do think that once you see the dam break there, it will break in a big way. And some of these targets that have been floating around as high value, high likelihood M&A targets will be taken off the table rapidly in quick succession. The other topic that we're watching closely, obviously on the VC side, is how these broader macro M&A trends are drifting down to the earlier stage companies. And we're seeing two things that are of interest there. One, I think we're starting to see more of a realization among companies that are maybe seed plus Series A that consolidation at that stage may make sense, where historically it hasn't made a ton of sense, especially if funding is readily available. I think you saw the first hints of that with Huddle and Deck Prism coming together recently, and I think that's another trend you're going to see quite a bit more of. And then the second thing that we're seeing is companies who are maybe at the B or C level that are starting to think more strategically about acquisition at that stage as an exit, as opposed to becoming an acquirer themselves. And so you're definitely seeing a bit of a pivot from some of that cream of the crop on the early stage private company side to thinking about exiting their business to an acquirer, whereas a year ago they might have described themselves as the likely acquirer and had their ambition and their targets set on that particular site.
Nic, it'd be good to get your perspective on this, and maybe also from this lead on to talking to us a little bit about the position in Canada this year. I know Ontario has had a thought to be very successful launch, but it would be good to know where things are at the moment and where they might be going.
Yeah, I mean, I think that before I jump into Ontario, I'll just comment a little bit on what Chris was, Chris and Harry and Josh were talking about. I mean, I think that the market, just the general market conditions have been very interesting to follow. And, speaking as an operator that just took in one of the most significant investments recently, the Susquehanna PointsBet deal got announced last week. And I think what that really shines a light onto is operators starting to realize that being able to control elements of their own product and their own tech stack will either put them into a unique category as the market consolidates, because ultimately the buy versus build conversation is not a new one in this space. And we're starting to see a lot of new innovative, I would call them data and trading, more market analytics solutions in companies, and also some content innovation that's really going to start driving what a lot of people are starting to think about what the next wave of watch and wager could look like. And so when all of these things are going to start coming together over the next 2 to 3 years, I think it's going to be I guess it was, Chris, you said it, the dam at some point is going to break. And I think it's those operators that have positioned themselves technologically, they're going to find themselves in a really interesting position, because, databases are acquirable, but product is not necessarily immediately buildable, if that makes sense. When it comes to Ontario, I think it's been an extraordinarily exciting launch. It's been a hyper competitive launch. It's been also a very complicated launch. April 4th was the day that the market officially opened. And this was after months of waiting until that launch date got solidified. So on April 4th, there were over 15 operators that had been licensed by the AGCO. And on day one, it was intense. And I think that the best analogy that I've heard, and I've said it internally a number of times, is in Ontario, because of the regulatory framework, which is very unique to a lot of the other parts of North America, we've literally been, and I say we by operators, regulators, processors, affiliate companies, content companies, we've all been flying the plane while we've been building it at the same time. So it's been hyper competitive, and we're all just trying to learn where the market is going to shift and evolve, because I think it is. I think there's more live operators now in Ontario than in any other market in North America. And a lot of the operators in Ontario came from the gray market space. As many of the folks who are watching this webinar understand, that Canada has serviced kind of offshore gray market sports betting for a number of years. And so as Ontario formally regulated and licensed, there were a lot of learnings that had to occur, not just from those gray market operators into the white space, but also from the consumers to try and understand what a white sports gaming experience actually is. So, yeah, I mean, I can, as I'm sure you all know, I can talk about Ontario for forever, but yeah, happy to dive into any specific details you'd like, Camilla and panel.
Thank you. Josh, I think you've also been in Canada recently, so be good to know your experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Just before that, I think it's important on insourcing to bear in mind that I think the argument sometimes argues that the whole industry is moving in-source, but actually it's quite unique to the platforms. When you look across the wheel, and I think this is one of the values of the wheel, is actually in areas like broader content, in slots development, in data in many instances, actually that's not a trend that has seen insourcing, and not one, going to Harry's point about capabilities and core strategy, that you would necessarily expect to see either. I just want to bring that point to the panel. On Canada, I think it's interesting, to your point, Nic, about uniqueness. It's very easy to draw comparisons to that market and the wider North American market. But actually, it's important to take a much more global view and also reference markets like the UK and Denmark, where I know IGO was focusing when they thought about regulation. And I know that there's expected to be 70 odd operators in the Canadian market in the next few months. But actually, you compare that to the UK, which has 300, 250, and actually the reference points do start to change quite dramatically. And I think one of the things with understanding markets more generally is making sure that those reference points are right. The other interesting thing with Canada is when you start to think about that channelization or the offshore market starting to move online, what will be really interesting is how operators start to respond to the latest news that the grey market, which has been able to operate pretty unfettered since April 4th, is due to start closing down.
A couple of things that I think are interesting to pick up off of Josh's comments. First is the recognition that M&A trends are usually not global. They are often regional, even as the companies behind them are increasingly global companies. So you will see and are seeing a move by US operators to try and insource at least some game development capability. That's not to say that they're interested in insourcing that entirely and producing all of their own content. But when I talk to folks from MGM, from Caesars, et cetera, about what their digital priorities are, casino content and the ability to insource at least some capability to develop proprietary games is at the top of the list. So an interesting note there, that what the story of M&A is in Canada versus the UK versus European markets versus African markets, LATAM, US, all likely to be driven by where those markets are at in their development trajectory, and also the relative size, scale, and ambition of the key stakeholders in those markets. So I think that's an interesting layer of color on top of M&A.
Content seems to be the biggest growth area in the BetTech ecosystem. So Harry, Chris, I guess one after the other, maybe, do you still see content as king, or is it just part of the overall deal?
I mean, yeah, from my perspective, and it probably isn't a surprise coming from someone who's part of Spotlight Sports Group, I see content as incredibly important, but the whole way through the journey. So I think when you look at other segments, they will be very important in terms of retaining a customer or in terms of facilitating a transaction. Whereas when I look at content, I think about it all the way at the top of the funnel in terms of how sports books operators can begin to secure new users and acquire new users, both from their own content channels, their media partners, their affiliates, and then all the way through to how do they retain them, how do they engage them, how do they keep them coming back. So I think it's probably the reason it's so wide a segment on the wheel is its diversity in terms of the types of content, where it sits along that user funnel, user journey, the types of content as well, whether it's editorial, you've got sort of depth from an AV perspective as well, and also where that content appears, whether it's through independent publishers and affiliates, whether it's as part of operators' offerings, whether it's from a social perspective. It's sort of a multi-dimensional segment of the wheel. So yeah, I think it's a very interesting one. It's one that if you spoke to the team that put this together, they get the most inbound requests and questions as to why have you not included us this year. So it probably speaks to why it's grown the most of any of the segments in the second version.
I think the other thing at play there is of all the segments of the wheel, it's arguably the one that has the lowest perceived barrier to entry. I want to emphasize perceived though, because just because you feel like you can create content doesn't necessarily mean that you're creating content that is durable, defensible, and of quality. But I think one of the reasons why you do see that overrepresented in the wheel, and we definitely see it overrepresented in terms of the decks that come across our desks as investors, is because of that perception that is the lowest barrier to entry. One of the topics that we watch most closely, and one of the things that we actually see a real deficit of within that ecosystem of content creators, is something rising to the level of really making, especially with sports betting, a little less so with casino, but rising to that level of finding a way to make sports betting genuinely entertaining from a viewer experience, in the same way that I think a lot of slot streamers have managed to make casino play genuinely entertaining as a passive experience. And I think the best example of it is how well online poker in the 2000s really created a vast constellation of genuinely entertaining content that was consumed by passive viewers, folks who were not engaging in those games as they were watching the content. That's one of the things that we're really on the lookout for on the content side, because I don't think that you're seeing anyone who's doing much beyond, at this point, taking the typical sports entertainment templates and layering them on top of the sports betting experience, as opposed to thinking about what's unique about sports betting and creating compelling content that is, again, entertaining on its own merits, in the same way that ESPN's coverage of the World Series of Poker or high stakes poker was genuinely entertaining content on its own merits. So I think that, yeah, go ahead, Nic.
Oh, no, I was just going to completely agree with Chris and Harry. I think from an operator's perspective, when you think about content, that content is not just top of funnel content, right? When you go all the way to the bottom of the funnel, I think, Chris, not to jump on you, and I apologize for that, where you were going is, as an operator, that wheel is so interesting towards the content and data convergence, because ultimately what we're seeing is, the live sports betting experience and the types of markets that are now starting to become possible. And I believe the markets, the live betting markets and the customizations that operators are going to be able to bring to making that experience of sports even more entertaining and fun, is what's really exciting to me from a content and from a data perspective, right? The content is not just words or video. It's also what operators are able to provide to their users at that bottom of funnel to excite them, to differentiate from other operators, and most importantly, to keep them coming back. So that's what's really interesting to me about that kind of convergence piece towards the bottom of the BetTech ecosystem, is how innovation and technology is allowing deeper, more interesting content, both top but also bottom of funnel as well.
Would any of the panel like to jump in on that, disagree, or add anything?
No, Nic, I think your point on differentiation and retention is in my mind a common theme across the wheel. Ultimately, the conversation we've been having on platforms, your point, Chris, about operators wanting to have unique content in the slots variety. I think all of that to me is a really competitive market. As an operator, how can the ecosystem enable people to differentiate and retain customers?
Two key essential elements of the wheel are platform providers and iCasino. Would love to get the thoughts of the panel on this, if anyone's got any extra perspective to add.
I'll jump in just with a little bit of color on the US experience so far. So at Eilers and Krejick, one of the things we do on a quarterly basis is a mix of quantitative and qualitative assessment of platform quality on the sportsbook side. And we have noticed a reasonably tight correlation between those rankings and market share. So we draw the broad conclusion that while product is relatively commoditized on some sides, there are definitely aspects of the product that are unique from a consumer experience and a quality product, especially when it comes to blocking and tackling, more of the boring but essential components of a platform. Those are definitely resonating with customers. So there's an interesting, I think, dichotomy in terms of how the industry thinks about sportsbook platform. Anyway, a lot of times, I think the default assumption is that sportsbooks just eventually end up at a point of commodification and that all experiences are relatively similar. So you just have operators competing on brand and promotion and other externalities. We haven't seen that in the US yet. Now, obviously, the US is in a very specific place in its evolution, and the pace of rollout in the market means that no one is anywhere close to the product they're likely to be sitting with 5-10 years out. But I think there is an interesting, at least, topic for discussion between that conventional wisdom of the inevitable commodification of sportsbook platforms versus the reality of, in emerging markets, we're definitely seeing a distinction between good product and not as good product, not to demean anyone. And I think even in more established markets, it's my view that sense of commodification as an inevitability is nice in theory, but maybe not necessarily holding up in practice. I'm curious what folks with more experience in those markets think about that topic.
Why don't I jump in there on the second point? I think in terms of that, I would completely agree with you, to be honest, Chris. I think the theory of all sports books end up looking the same, and it's just who has the best access to eyeballs wins out. From what I've seen, it hasn't proved to be the case in any market as yet. There's always people who will look to differentiate and win on product. There's also people who will always look to differentiate and win from a branding and marketing perspective, and there's often room for both to compete, and often it's a question of it almost always is who the customer is and what they're looking for. And there are people who will look for the most seamless sports betting experience. There are people who will look for the best price. There'll be people who look for who has a brand that they recognize and is represented by personalities that resonate with them. So I think it's going to be a combination of all of those. But yeah, I think the intricacies of the US market and the way it has evolved so far in terms of sort of race for market share early on once states launch, and the fact that further states will launch in the coming years means that even, I suspect we're many years away from even that being the case, where sports books are looking to solely differentiate on product versus anything else.
Given the evolution we've seen in just 2 editions of the BetTech project, how do you see the sportsbook of the future, say in 5 years?
Wow. Okay,
I'll go first.
I'll go.
All right, Nic,
Chris.
you go first.
So
you go first, and I'll disagree with you. How about that?
Fair enough.
I'm looking forward to your forecast of where the economy is going to be in 12 months or so.
Yeah, I am definitely. That's exactly where I'm going to be leaning in my projections now. I think very similar to what we experienced in Canada in the cannabis industry when cannabis regulated is going to hold true in the gaming space, where especially, and I'll speak to the Canadian experience, When cannabis launched, there were dozens and dozens of operators. Fast forward 5 years or 4 years, it consolidated to about 3 or 4. So I think we will see consolidation, but where I see 5 years from now, what I think is going to have the biggest impact, and I'll speak from a sportsbook perspective, less so from a casino perspective, because that's not my kind of area of expertise. Not to suggest that I'm an expert in it by any stretch, is what the streaming and what the new media companies who are coming into the sports worlds what kind of impact they're going to have. Obviously, we all saw the Apple MLS deal that was announced a couple weeks ago. I think that when it comes to the streaming rights of major professional North American sports and how sports and iGaming operators are going to either work alongside, get acquired by, or partner with these major new entrants into the live broadcast rights game. I think when we fast forward 5 years, I think one of these major streaming services are also going to become a major sports betting and iGaming operator, just because of the top of funnel eyeballs that their end users are going to be able to generate through just the massive shift in the paradigm of how users consume, especially major North American live sports.
So I'll half agree with Nic and half disagree just for the fun of it. I agree in the sense that I think you're going to see much tighter integration across broadcasts, especially across streaming, where you have the opportunity for more heavily personalized broadcasts and more heavily segmented and fragmented broadcasts, as opposed to a singular broadcast that we're all experiencing in the same way. But I think that it'll stop at deep integration as opposed to actual acquisition or the operating of a sports book by, an Apple or an Amazon or a Google. There's certainly a lot of quality arguments to be made about why it might make economic sense for those companies to engage in that activity. But I think the thing that's ultimately going to be the stopper is the fact that all of those companies I just described, Apple to the least degree, but Amazon, definitely Google as well, are currently subject to an intense amount of scrutiny from state regulators over other commercial activity, and will be loath to introduce another vector for intersection with state regulators, which gambling would do immediately. And it would create a very powerful lever in terms of the license that you hold as a gambling operator and how that license is binary. It's on or it's off. And so the ability of states to hold that over operators like Amazon, Apple, Google, et cetera, I think a lot of those companies will decide that, as attractive as the economics may be, from a unit perspective, ultimately, they're still not really going to move the needle of the balance sheet of any of those kinds of media companies in that tranche. And the extra layer of potentially problematic exposure to state regulators will be something that says, okay, this is interesting, let's have a partner handle it, and let's keep it as arm's length as we need to avoid that extra step of licensure and regulation. That's assuming that we still have a gaming regulation scheme and structure in the US here in 10 years, which is a totally separate question, probably for a totally separate webinar.
Maybe next time. Josh, you have a perspective from, I think, Canada, North America, UK. Okay, where are we in 5 years?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think there's been interesting points brought up from Nic and Chris already. I think the three things I'd probably add is one, personalization is going to be a key driver. To the point about how do you differentiate and how do customers engage differently, I think we're only just starting to scratch the surface of what a genuinely personalized experience could look like. Maybe 5 years is a little bit ambitious, but the metaverse is going to be critical, and I don't think operators are thinking about this in the same way that maybe retailers are starting to engage with it. I think the third point is Generation Alpha is going to start to reach betting maturity in the next 5, maybe 10 years, and that will be a group of people who have demonstrated engagement with content, which is quite fundamentally different to how current bettors engage with content, and therefore the way that they're going to want their betting to be provided to them is something that I think operators are going to have to start thinking about.
Harry, that's do you want to move on to Generation Alpha or give us a wider perspective?
No, unfortunately, I was going to take a position on personalization as well, but Josh has sort of straddled it being important, but also not going to be something that happens as much as we'll think in the next 5 years. So it's hard to contradict that, given it sort of straddles both points of view. I think, I guess, linked to that somewhat. My view would be that the product in the next sort of 4 to 5 years actually may not move on as far as people think it will or people say it will. But actually, when you look kind of beyond that, maybe on a sort of 7, 8, 10-year time horizon, it will look entirely different for how we think about it today. So, which probably partly links to the personalization point. Completely agree, unfortunately, with what Josh said in terms of how, if you look at other industries, e-commerce, travel, especially in dynamic pricing from that perspective, how the offering is completely unique to any individual based on their past behaviors and performance. But that has been talked about in the sportsbook industry or in the sports betting industry for many, many years. And it feels like, whilst if you take a North America or we haven't talked about other markets that are potentially opening up in the near future, some of territories in LATAM, the likes of Brazil and elsewhere, whilst the race will be on to launch and grow in new states, in new territories, getting to that deeper level of customer understanding and how you tailor a product to them will probably be a lot further along in terms of years than we expect.
Well, thank you all for your input and the insight that you've shared with us today. That was a really enjoyable discussion. I think I've learned quite a lot, although I was expecting more of you to disagree with each other on these points. But to hear more from our experts and to download the 2022 BetTech Ecosystem Visual and Report, please visit spotlightsportsgroup.com. Thank you for your time today, everybody.